My name is Dana, and I was 35 years old, sitting at my parents' Thanksgiving table with everything I owned packed into 2 suitcases in their spare room, when my father raised his glass, looked straight down the table at me, and called me a burden in front of our entire family. He didn't whisper it. He didn't pull me aside. He said it the way a man announces a toast, loud enough for all 12 relatives to hear over the clatter of serving spoons. "Let's just be honest for once," he said, swirling his wine like he was about to say something wise. "Some people in this family build something with their lives, and some people just turn into a burden on everybody else." And then he looked right at me. Not near me. At me. My mother found something fascinating to study on her napkin. My older brother smirked down into his mashed potatoes. And around that table, 12 people who had known me my entire life went very, very quiet, and not one of them, not a single soul, said a word in my defense. I set down my fork. I did not cry, though God knows the tears were right there, burning behind my eyes, waiting. I would not give him that, not in front of all of them. So I stood up, slowly, and I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate the way my mother had taught me, and I thanked her quietly for the meal. And then I walked out of that house into the cold November dark, past the coats piled on the bed, past the family photos in the hallway where my school pictures got smaller and Bryce's got bigger, and out the front door I'd walked through 10,000 times. I got in my truck. My hands were shaking. And I drove away from my parents' house with 2 suitcases, holding everything I owned in the world and about $400 to my name. 7 months later, I owned that table. I owned the chair my father was sitting in when he said it. I owned the floor under his feet and the roof over his head, because 7 months after my father called me a burden at Thanksgiving dinner, I bought his house out from under him. Legally, completely, with my name on the deed. And I am going to tell you exactly how a burden does that. Welcome to Composed Drama Stories, where the women everyone underestimated finally tell their side. If quiet strength and slow justice are your kind of evening, stay with me. Now, before you picture some movie where I storm in and throw them out into the street, I need you to stay with me all the way to the end. Because what I actually did when I finally held the keys to my parents' house surprised even me, and it's the whole point of this story. I'm going to take you to a foreclosure auction where I bid on my own childhood home with my heart in my throat, and to a living room full of moving boxes where my father found out who the buyer really was. But I'm also going to tell you the thing nobody at that Thanksgiving table knew, the secret about who had really been the burden in our family all along, sitting 3 seats away, smirking into the mashed potatoes. To understand all of it, you have to understand the girl who walked out of that dinner with $400 and a wound the size of a house. So let me take you back. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood on the east side of Indianapolis, the second of 2 kids. And from the time I was small, the roles in our family were cast, and they never changed. My older brother Bryce was the golden one. Bryce was charming and quick and good at the things that look impressive at a dinner party. He wore nice clothes. He talked a big game. He was always 2 weeks away from the deal that was going to make him rich. And my parents, Dennis and Sandra, worshipped him. To them, Bryce was the success, the one with vision, the son who was going to put the family name on something. And me? I was the one who was good with my hands. I want you to understand what that meant in my family, because it's the root of everything. From the time I was a kid, I loved building things. I'd follow my grandfather around with a hammer. He was a carpenter. The one person in my whole childhood who ever looked at what I could do and smiled instead of frowning. By the time I was 12, I could frame a wall. By high school, I could hang a door, fix a leaking trap under a sink, read a set of blueprints. I didn't want to sit behind a desk. I wanted to take something broken and make it whole, and I was good at it better than good. But in my parents' eyes, working with your hands was something you did because you couldn't do anything better. It embarrassed them. I'll give you the small moments, because the small moments are where favoritism actually lives. When Bryce brought home a C, my father would clap him on the back and call him a big picture guy that school just couldn't keep up with. When I brought home an A in shop class, my mother would sigh and ask when I was going to take something that could lead somewhere. Bryce got a car at 17 for all his potential. I got a part-time job at a hardware store, and the comment that it suited me. At every family gathering, the same script ran. Bryce's plans got discussed like prophecy, and my work got a polite, pitying nod before everyone moved on to the interesting child. I learned, the way the overlooked child always learns, to stop expecting the applause and just do the work, but the little girl part of me never fully stopped hoping that one day I'd build something big enough that my father would finally see me. When I told them, at 18, that I wasn't going to a 4-year college, that I was going to learn the building trades and work in construction and someday flip houses, my father looked at me like I'd announced I was joining the circus. "That's not a career, Dana," he said. "That's a hobby for people who give up." Those words, a hobby for people who give up, I carried them for 15 years, like a stone in my shoe. Meanwhile, Bryce was off at a state school he'd eventually drop out of, and they bragged about him to the neighbors, as though dropping out had been a bold entrepreneurial move. So I built my life the hard way, with no help, and a lot of doubt. And I'll spare you the long version, but here's where I'd gotten by my early 30s. I had become a general contractor. I had clawed my way into the house flipping business, and if you don't know it, flipping is exactly what it sounds like. You buy a house that's a wreck, the kind nobody else wants, and you fix everything wrong with it, with your own 2 hands and your own crew, and you sell it for more than you put in. It is brutal, risky, exhausting work, and I loved it, and I was finally, after a decade of struggle, starting to do well at it. I had a small reputation. I had a crew that trusted me. For the first time in my life, I'd built something real. And then I had the worst year of my life, all at once, the way disaster always seems to come. First, my marriage ended. I won't go deep into it, because it's not really this story, but my husband decided after 7 years that he wanted a different life than the one we'd built. And the divorce was ugly, and it cleaned me out lawyers, splitting what little we had, the slow, grinding loneliness of it. And at the exact same time, in the worst possible timing imaginable, the biggest flip I'd ever taken on went sideways. I'd sunk every dollar I had into a property, betting on myself the way I always had. And when we opened up the walls, we found the kind of problems no inspection ever catches a cracked foundation. Hidden water damage, rot in the bones of the place, the surprises that eat a budget alive. In a week. And the market softened at the exact wrong moment. I poured everything I had left into trying to save that project, and it dragged me under, and by that autumn I was, for the first time since I was 18 years old, completely broke. Divorced, broke, and bone tired, with the business I'd spent a decade building hanging by a single thread. So I did the thing I had sworn I would never do. I swallowed my pride, and I asked my parents if I could stay in my old room for a few months just to regroup, just until I got back on my feet. And they said yes. But I should have heard the way they said it. There was a sigh in it, a glance between them, like they were confirming something they'd always suspected, like the hands dirty daughter showing up broke was the ending they'd been quietly waiting 15 years to watch. For 2 months, I lived in that spare room, and I want to tell you, I did not lie around feeling sorry for myself. I was up at 5 every morning, taking every contracting job I could find, fixing other people's houses, hanging drywall, doing punch list work for other flippers, anything that paid. Anything to start rebuilding my capital one day at a time. I paid my parents what I could for letting me stay. I cooked dinners. I cleaned the kitchen. I fixed every broken thing in that house I could find. The leaky faucet, the sticking door, the dead outlet. Quietly, without being asked, because fixing things was the only language of love I had. None of it registered, because in the story my parents had already decided to tell, I had failed, plain and simple. The hands dirty daughter had finally proven that her whole life was exactly what they'd always called it, a hobby for people who give up. And Bryce, meanwhile, was riding high on his newest can't-miss business. The one my parents were so proud of. The one I would soon learn the terrible truth about, which brings us back to that Thanksgiving table. I think about that dinner a lot, even now, because of how ordinary it was right up until it wasn't. The whole extended family was there, aunts, uncles, cousins, the good china out, the house smelling like sage and butter. Bryce was holding court at the center of it all, telling everyone about his business, how big it was about to get, the round of funding that was just around the corner, and my parents were glowing at him the way they had glowed at him our whole lives. And at some point, my Aunt Carol, trying to be kind, turned to me and asked how my work was going. And before I could even open my mouth, my father answered for me, with that toast. He set down his fork, he picked up his glass, and he set it to the whole table. Some people build something with their lives, and some people just turn into a burden on everybody else. And he looked at me, dead on, with 2 suitcases of my entire life sitting upstairs in his spare room, and he made me the punchline of his Thanksgiving toast. You have to understand what that word does to a person. Burden. I had spent my entire life being the capable one, the one who fixed things, the one who never asked for a dime, and the one time, the single time in 35 years that I was down and needed a soft place to land. The people who were supposed to catch me looked at me and saw dead weight. Not their daughter, going through the worst year of her life. Not a strong woman who'd been knocked down by a divorce and a foundation crack nobody could have predicted. A burden. Something to be resented. Something heavy and useless they were stuck carrying. I felt the heat climb up my neck and into my face. I felt 12 pairs of eyes flick toward me and then away. Fast. The way people look away from a car wreck. And I felt the specific, bottomless loneliness of being humiliated by your own father in a room full of people who'd known you since you were born, and watching every single one of them decide that staying comfortable was more important than saying one word for you. And here is the part that I didn't even know yet. Sitting at that table with my face burning the part that turns this whole story on its head. Because while my father was calling me a burden, the truth was the exact opposite of what everyone in that room believed. I wasn't the one dragging that family down. I was about to find out who really was, and it was sitting 3 seats away, smirking into the mashed potatoes. I left that night. I didn't slam a door or make a scene. I just gathered my 2 suitcases, thanked my mother quietly for the meal, and walked out into the cold while my father was still basking in the little laugh his toast had earned from a couple of the uncles. I texted a buddy of mine from the trades, a guy named Marcus who had a finished basement and a good heart, and I asked if I could crash with him for a while, and he wrote back within a minute. Of course, no questions, doors open. That's worth saying, by the way, that in the hour my own family called me a burden, it was a friend from the job sites my parents looked down on, who took me in without a second's hesitation. The people who work with their hands know something about showing up. And I lay on Marcus's pull-out couch that first night, 35 years old, divorced, broke, and freshly, publicly branded the family failure in front of everyone I was related to, and I waited to fall apart. I really did. I figured I'd earned a collapse. And it didn't come. Something else came instead. Somewhere in that dark basement, staring at the ceiling, the hurt burned down into something harder and cleaner and more useful than tears. And I made myself a promise, not a revenge fantasy. I genuinely didn't have the energy for one of those that night. But something simpler and more dangerous than revenge. I promised myself that I was done. Done trying to earn the respect of people who had decided 3 decades ago that I didn't deserve it. Done shrinking myself to fit their idea of me. Done apologizing for the calluses on my hands. I had built a real business once, from absolutely nothing, with no help and no degree and no one believing in me, and the only thing that had knocked it down was one freak year and a foundation crack that no human being could have seen coming. I knew how to do this. I was good at this, better than good. And I was going to get up off Marcus's couch and build the whole thing back, not to prove a single thing to my father, but because it was mine, and because nobody on this earth was ever going to make me believe I was a burden again. That was the night the 7 months started. And I want to be straight with you about those 7 months, because the title makes it sound like a magic trick burden one day, homeowner the next, and it was nothing of the kind. There was no inheritance, no lawsuit settlement, no lottery ticket, no rich new boyfriend. None of the things people assume when they hear a story like mine. There was a woman with cracked hands and $400 who knew one thing how to do, and did it, harder than she'd ever done anything in her life, every single day, until the math finally turned in her favor. If you're waiting for the part where luck saves me, there isn't one. The only thing that saved me was the exact skill my family had spent 30 years telling me was worthless. So let me show you how it actually went. Let me tell you how I clawed back. Because there was no magic in it. No lottery ticket. No rich benefactor. There was just work, the kind my family had always looked down on. The kind that turns out to be the most reliable thing in the world. I went back to what I knew. I took on every job I could carry, and then a few I probably shouldn't have. I did contracting work during the day for steady cash. I rewired a dentist's office. I gutted and rebuilt a bathroom for a family who'd been quoted double by somebody else. I framed an addition in the rain in March because the money was good and I needed every dollar. I rebuilt my reputation one honest job at a time. Showing up early, finishing clean, charging fair. The way you build a name in a trade, which is the only way that lasts. And at night and on the weekends, exhausted, I went hunting for the one thing I really needed to turn the corner. A flip I could buy cheap, do fast, and do right. And I found one, a sad little foreclosed house in a neighborhood everybody had written off. The kind of property other flippers drove past because the work scared them. But the work didn't scare me. The work was the one place in the world I had never once felt like a burden. I scraped together the money to buy it, using the last of my credit. And a hard money loan that's a short-term, high-interest loan that flippers use when banks won't move fast enough and I bet everything I had left on my own 2 hands. And I lived in that house while I fixed it. I want you to picture that. Really picture it. Because this is where I became the woman who could buy a house in 7 months. I slept on an air mattress in a gutted house with no working kitchen and a bathroom I'd half torn out. And I ate cold sandwiches and showered at the gym. And I got up every single morning before the sun, and I did the work myself. Demolition, framing, drywall, taped and mudded and sanded until my arms shook. Tile I set on my knees, the wiring I'd spent years learning, the plumbing I'd spent years learning. Every trade I had mastered over 15 years while my family called it a hobby, I poured into that one wrecked little house. 14, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. There were nights I lay on that air mattress in the dark. Every muscle screaming, my hands so cracked I could barely close them. And the doubt would creep in the voice that sounded an awful lot like my father, asking what made me think a hobbyist could climb out of a hole this deep. And every time, I'd answer it the same way, by getting up the next morning and picking up the nail gun again. Because here is the truth I'd learned in 15 years of this work. The truth that saved my life that winter. A person who knows how to build can always, always build her way out. The world can take your money, your marriage, your good name at the family dinner table, but it cannot take the skill in your hands. That skill was the one thing no one had ever been able to give me, and no one could ever take away. And in that freezing, half-finished house, it was the only thing I had, and it turned out to be enough. That flip sold in the spring, and it sold well better than well, because I'd bought it right and done the work right, and the market had turned back up while I was swinging a hammer. And just like that, the worst year of my life cracked open and let some light back in. I paid off the hard money loan in full. I had real capital again, and a credit score climbing back out of the basement, and a reputation that was suddenly worth something because people had seen what I'd pulled off. And the hard, quiet confidence of a woman who had hit the absolute bottom and built her own ladder back out of it. 4 months after that Thanksgiving, I wasn't a burden. I was a contractor with cash in the bank and a fire in me I'd never had before. The funny thing is, if my father had never said that word, if he'd just let me lick my wounds quietly in that spare room for a few months and get back on my feet the slow way I'm not sure I ever would have found that fire. Cruelty has a way of clarifying things. He'd meant to put me in my place. Instead, he lit the fuse on the best year of work I'd ever done. I should almost thank him. Almost. But here's the thing that was happening while I was rebuilding the thing I started hearing about through the grapevine. Because the construction and real estate world in a city like Indianapolis is smaller than you'd think, and word travels. My parents were drowning. It came to me in pieces, the way the worst truths usually do. A guy I knew at a title company mentioned offhand, not having any idea he was talking about my family, that the Hartley place over on the east side had a notice of default filed against it. A notice of default, let me explain, because it's the first domino. It's the official, public, recorded notice that a homeowner has stopped making their mortgage payments. The lender's formal way of saying, "You are in serious trouble, and if you don't fix this fast, we are going to take your home." My parents' house. The house I grew up in. The house with the dining room where I'd been called a burden over turkey 7 months before. At first, it made no sense to me at all, because that house should have been nearly paid off. My parents had lived there 30 years. 30 years of mortgage payments should have meant they owned that place outright, free and clear, with a small fortune of equity built up inside its walls. So, I did what I do for a living. I'm in this business. I know how to pull public records. And so can anyone who knows where to look, and I started reading. And the truth assembled itself in front of me, document by document, and it was uglier and sadder than anything I'd imagined sitting at that Thanksgiving table. They had drained the house. Over the previous few years, my parents had taken out a second mortgage and then a home equity line of credit against the house. That's where you borrow against the value you've built up in your home over the years, turning the paid-for roof over your head back into a pile of debt. They'd pulled nearly every dollar of equity out of the home they'd spent 30 years paying off, and they had poured all of it, every cent, into Bryce. Bryce's can't-miss business, the one they bragged about at that very Thanksgiving, the one that made me the failure by comparison, was a sinkhole. And it had been a sinkhole for years. My golden brother had been quietly failing the entire time he was holding court at family dinners, and my parents had been secretly bailing him out, again and again, refinancing their own home to keep his dream on life support. Because in their eyes, you see, Bryce was the investment and I was the burden. Bryce was worth mortgaging the house for. I wasn't worth a few months in the spare room. They had looked at their 2 children and decided, with their money, with the most honest vote a person ever casts, which one was worth everything and which one was worth nothing. And when Bryce's business finally, completely collapsed that winter, when there was no more equity to pull and no more money to pour in and no deal that was ever going to come, Bryce did what Bryce had always done. He vanished. He took whatever was left, he moved across the country, and he stopped answering their calls. He left our 70-year-old parents, holding a mountain of debt against a house they could no longer afford, on a fixed retirement income that couldn't begin to cover it, sliding straight toward foreclosure. The golden child they'd sacrificed everything for took their last dollar and ran, and didn't look back. The golden child had bankrupted them and disappeared, and the burden was the only one still standing. I sat in my truck in a parking lot the day I finally pieced it all together, the records open on my phone, and I felt about 6 things at once. I felt vindicated, I won't lie to you about that. There was a bitter, ringing vindication in it. I felt furious at Bryce, at them, at 30 years of being told I was the lesser child by people who were about to lose everything because of the greater one. But underneath all of it, I felt something I did not expect at all. And it's the feeling that ended up steering the entire rest of this story. I felt the strangest, saddest, most inconvenient flicker of recognition because I knew exactly what it was like to be down and have your own family look the other way. I had felt it across a Thanksgiving table 7 months before. And now I was watching it happen to the very people who had done it to me, abandoned, in their worst hour, by the child they'd loved best. Now I had a decision to make. And I want to walk you through it honestly, because this is the part where the story could have gone a dozen different ways, and I sat with every one of them. The house was going to foreclosure auction. Let me explain what that is, plainly. Because it's the engine of everything that happened next. When a homeowner falls far enough behind, the lender takes the house and sells it off at a public auction, sometimes right on the courthouse steps, sometimes online to the highest bidder, often for a fraction of what it's actually worth. Because the bank doesn't want a house, it just wants its money back. So, my childhood home, the place where I'd been humiliated over turkey, was going to be sold to a stranger. Some investor who'd never set foot inside it, who'd never patched its plaster or learned to walk in its dark, would buy it cheap and flip it or rent it out, and my parents would be evicted and walk away from 30 years with nothing but boxes. Unless somebody bought it first. And I was, by then, exactly the kind of somebody who could. I had the capital from my flip. I had the credit, clawing its way back up. I knew foreclosure auctions the way other people know their commute. I'd bought houses at them before. I knew how to register, how to research a title, how to line up financing, how to show up on auction day with a cashier's check and walk away with a deed in my hand. The thing my family had spent my entire life sneering at my grubby, hands dirty, hobby for quitters knowledge of houses and contracts and how money actually moves in the real world was, it turned out, the one skill on this earth that could save that house. Or take it. And I'll be honest with you about the war I fought in my own head, because it was a real one. Part of me said, walk away, let it burn. They made their bed when they mortgaged it for Bryce. Let them lie in the wreckage. You don't owe these people the air in the room, let alone a rescue. And that part of me had a point, a sharp one. But another part of me, the part my grandfather built, the part that has never once in my life been able to drive past something broken without wanting to make it whole, couldn't stand the thought of strangers picking the bones of the house I grew up in, while two old people I was, God help me, still related to, got put out on the curb. And underneath both of those, quietly, was the realest reason of all. I needed to know who I was. Not who they said I was, who I actually was, when I held all the power for once. I decided I would rather find out by building than by burning. So I made my choice. I was going to buy that house. I did not tell my parents. I want to be clear about that. Because people always ask. I didn't call them up to gloat, didn't dangle it over them, didn't make them beg. I went quiet, the way I do when something matters, and I did the work. I set up the purchase through my company. My flipping business is an LLC, which just means it's its own legal entity, with its own name, the way nearly everyone in my line of work operates, so that the business and your personal life stay separate. So when I registered to bid, and later when the paperwork went through, my parents' house wasn't being bought by anybody named Dana Hartley. It was being bought by a company with a name they would never recognize. They had no idea, right up until the very end, that the buyer circling their home was the daughter they'd thrown away over a turkey dinner. I spent the weeks before that auction doing the most careful due diligence of my life. I pulled the comparable sales. I figured out, to the dollar, what the house was actually worth, and the absolute most I could responsibly pay and still have it make sense. I lined up my financing. I knew, walking in, exactly where my ceiling was, because the fastest way to ruin yourself at a foreclosure auction is to let your heart bid instead of your head, and, Lord knows, my heart had a lot to say about this particular house. Auction day came on a gray morning, and I stood there with a cashier's check in my jacket, and my heart slamming against my ribs. A foreclosure auction, if you've never seen one, is a strangely quiet, brutal little event. A handful of investors, a trustee or auctioneer reading off legal language, and then bidding on somebody's whole life in increments, fast with no ceremony. And there were a couple of other investors there sniffing around my childhood home, the way they do, looking for a cheap flip, and when the bidding opened, my stomach was in my throat. One of them bid. I bid. He came back. I came back. For a few minutes, it was just the two of us, and I could feel my ceiling getting closer, and I felt the old panic, the broke and divorced panic, rising up, and then I remembered who I was now. I remembered I'd done my homework, that I knew this house down to the studs, that I'd helped patch its plaster with my own grandfather's hands, and that no investor in that little crowd wanted it the way I did, or knew what it was worth the way I did. The other bidder hesitated. He shook his head, He dropped out. The auctioneer called it once, twice, and brought down the gavel, and the house where my father had called me a burden 7 months earlier became. With the bang of that gavel, and a check I had earned with my own 2 cracked hands, mine, I owned it. Free of the relatives who sat silent, free of the smirking, free of 30 years of being the lesser child. The deed to the roof over my parents' heads had my company's name on it, and behind that name was me. And now I have to tell you about the day they found out, because that's the real reckoning. And it didn't look like anything I'd ever imagined on Marcus's couch. By the time the sale was final, my parents had received their notice to vacate the formal order to move out, because the house had been sold. They were terrified. 70 years old between them, no savings, no equity, a son who'd vanished, packing up 30 years of a life with nowhere to go, about to be put out of their home by a faceless company. My mother, I heard later from an aunt, had been crying for days. I drove over on a Saturday morning. I let myself in. I had every legal right to. It was my house now, and I found my parents in the living room surrounded by half-packed boxes. 30 years of a life in cardboard. My father smaller than I had ever seen him. My mother's eyes red and swollen. The good china from that Thanksgiving was wrapped in newspaper on the dining table. And when they saw me standing there in the doorway, my father's face did this complicated, terrible thing, shame and confusion, and the old reflexive irritation all fighting at once, and he said, "Dana, this really isn't a good time. And he gestured helplessly at the boxes. And he couldn't finish the sentence, because the proud man simply could not make his mouth say the words "we're being put out of our home." And I stood there, and I looked at my father, the man who had called me a burden in this very house, who had spent 30 years telling me my hands were good for nothing. And I felt the whole weight of the moment settle over the room, and I said, quietly, "I know, Dad. I know exactly what's happening here. Because the company that bought this house, it's mine. I bought it. It's my name behind the deed now." I have never in my life heard a silence like the one that filled that living room. I watched it land on them, slow, like a wave you see coming, but can't move out of the way of. I watched my father do the math, the daughter he'd branded a burden at that table in the next room, 7 months ago, was now the legal owner of the house he was standing in, the house he was about to be evicted from. I watched him understand that the hands-dirty hobby he had mocked for 3 decades had just accomplished the one thing his golden son never could, the one thing that actually mattered when everything fell apart. It had shown up. My mother made a small broken sound and put her hand over her mouth. My father sat down, hard, on a moving box, like his legs had quit on him. And he stared at the floor of the house his daughter owned. And here is what I had decided in the truck, in the weeks of doing the work, in the long nights of turning it over, the thing that surprised even me. I want you to hear it exactly the way I said it to them, because it is the truest thing I have ever said to anyone. I said, "I'm not here to throw you out. I need you to understand that first, because I know it's what you're afraid of, and I know it's probably exactly what you'd expect from somebody you'd treated the way you treated me. But I'm not going to do it. You can stay in this house. We'll work out something fair, something you can actually afford on what you've got, and you can live here for as long as you need to." My father started to say something, and I held up my hand, gently, because I wasn't finished. And the next part was the part that had taken me 7 months to be able to say. "I'm not doing this because I owe you anything," I said. "I want to be honest about that. because I'm done with us not being honest. 7 months ago, I was at the lowest point of my entire life. I'd lost my marriage and my business and every dollar I had, and I came to my own family for a soft place to land for a few months, and you looked at me, and you saw a burden. You said it out loud, at that table right there, in front of everyone we're related to, and not one person stood up for me, including you two. That broke something in me. I'm not going to stand here and pretend it didn't, because it did, and some of it's never going to fully heal. But here's what I figured out while I was sleeping on an air mattress and building my way back. I know exactly what it feels like to be down all the way down and have the people who are supposed to catch you decide you're not worth catching. I know that feeling in my bones now. You taught it to me. And because I know it, I could never ever do it to another human being. Not to a stranger. Not even to the two people who did it to me. You called me a burden when I was weak. I'm not going to call you one now that you are. That's the only difference between us that's ever really mattered, and it turns out it's the whole difference in the world. My mother was weeping by then. The real kind. The kind that comes from somewhere that's been locked a long time. And my father, my proud, hard, certain father, the man with a cutting little remark for every occasion, looked up at me from that moving box, and for the first time in my entire 35 years, he had absolutely nothing to say. No toast. No wisdom. No correction. There was just a 70-year-old man, sitting on a box in a house his daughter owned, finally, completely understanding which of his 2 children had been the burden all along, and which had been the load-bearing wall holding the whole house up the entire time he was mocking her for the calluses on her hands. Let me tell you how it all settled. Because the justice in this story was quiet, and it was complete, and it didn't require me to be cruel even once. My parents stayed in the house. They live there still, and they pay me a modest rent, far less than the place is worth. Which means that every single month, the daughter they called a burden is the reason they have a roof over their heads. I did not do that to humiliate them. I want to be honest. Though I'd be lying if I said the quiet, permanent inversion of it isn't its own kind of justice. The slow, grinding, daily kind that no shouting match ever could have delivered. They cannot pour their morning coffee in that kitchen without knowing whose house it is. They cannot walk past the dining room where that toast was made without remembering who actually saved them and who actually sank them, and how completely, how catastrophically, they'd had it backwards for 30 years. There's no speech that lands like that. Only a deed. Bryce never came back. The golden child, the investment, the great hope of the family name, he stayed gone, dodging the wreckage he'd made, and the last anyone heard, he was somewhere out west, still chasing the next can't-miss deal, still 2 weeks from being rich. My parents don't talk about him much anymore. There is nothing in this world quite like watching the child you sacrificed everything for vanish in your hour of need, while the child you discarded turns out to be the one standing in the doorway with the keys. I think they sit with that, in the quiet, in the house that isn't theirs. I think it's the heaviest thing they carry now. And the family, the aunts and uncles and cousins who sat silent at that table, while my own father called me a burden, they all know now. You cannot keep a thing like this quiet in a family. They know that Bryce bankrupted my parents and ran, and that Dana, the failure, the hobbyist, the burden, bought the house at auction and let them stay. The whole story of who I was got rewritten in that family, and I never had to give a single speech to do it. What I did rewrote it for me. I have not had to defend myself at a dinner table since. The deed does my talking now. As for me, I am doing better than I have ever done in my life. My business is thriving. That terrible year turned out to be the fire that forged the version of me who doesn't flinch anymore, who doesn't bid with her heart, who knows exactly what her own two hands are worth. I own several properties now, including, of course, the one that matters most. But the real change, the one I didn't see coming, isn't the money. It's that I finally, completely stopped needing my father to believe I'd built something with my life. I don't lie awake hoping for his approval anymore. I know what I built. I'm standing in it. I sign the rent receipts. So here's what I learned, and I'll give it to you straight. The way I wish someone had given it to me on that pull-out couch in the dark. The people who are quickest to call you a burden are very often the exact people you have been carrying. That is not a coincidence. It's almost a law of nature. The one who fixes everything, who asks for nothing, who always shows up, she becomes invisible precisely because she is so dependable. Until the one day she finally stumbles and needs something. And suddenly everyone notices her. And the word they reach for is burden. They never once noticed the weight she carried. Because weight you don't have to lift yourself is weight you don't see. But a burden is just the name that small people give to the load-bearing wall, right up until the moment it walks out of the house and the whole thing comes down around their ears. My father learned that. It cost him a house to learn it. It cost him watching the wrong child take everything and run, and the right child come back with the keys. So if you have been called a burden by people who only valued you when you were useful, who took your strength for granted for years, and then resented you the one season you were weak, I need you to hear this part with both ears. Their words are not a verdict on your worth. They are a confession of their character. When someone tells you that you are a burden, they are not describing you. They are describing the limit of their own love. And that limit is theirs to carry, not yours. So set it down. Do not spend one more day of your one life trying to prove yourself to people who decided, long before you ever stumbled, not to see you. You will never build the thing big enough to make them clap, because the not seeing was never about what you built. Build it for yourself instead. Get up off the couch, pick up the tools that are yours, whatever your tools are, and build your way back. One brick, one board, one day at a time. The skill in your own two hands is the one thing in this world that no divorce, no bad year, and no cruel man at the head of a table can ever take from you. And then this is the last thing, and it is the one I most want you to carry out of here tonight when you rise. And you will rise, and you find yourself one day holding real power over the very people who hurt you. Be better than they were. Not because they earned it. Because you did. Because the sweetest victory in this entire world is not revenge, is just becoming the thing that hurt you. The sweetest victory is looking the people who called you a burden dead in the eye, from a position of total, unshakable strength, and choosing to be the kind of person they never had the heart to be. That is not weakness. Do not let anyone tell you mercy from a position of power is weakness. It is the single most powerful thing a human being can do. I learned it standing in a house I bought with my own two hands, the same two hands my father spent 30 years swearing were worth nothing. Turns out they were worth a house. Turns out they were worth everything. If this story reached something in you tonight, if you've ever been called a burden by the people who should have caught you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their worst day is not the verdict on their life. Drop a comment and tell me about the moment you stopped trying to prove yourself to people who refused to see you. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.